The morning came pale and brittle, a frozen hush settling over the outskirts of the small town, where two young girls walked, shoulders bent against a wind that cut sharper than knives. Frost had claimed the fields, leaving each blade of grass etched in silver, and the thin sun struggled to lift its light over the distant ridges. Their boots crunched over frozen earth, the sound small but insistent, a rhythm that matched the careful, guarded way they moved. The older girl, 19, carried a worn satchel on one shoulder, its leather stiff and cracked from years of use, and a woolen scarf wrapped tight around her neck, frayed edges brushing her chin. The younger, barely 18, held a small bundle of food wrapped in cloth, her fingers stiff and red, the tips cracked from cold. Both faces were pale, not from the frost alone, but from nights spent awake with worry, hunger, and the uncertainty of where the next shelter might be. They had been cast out. No dramatic falling out, no shouted accusations, just the quiet verdict of a world that would not wait for children who were too young, too small, too inexperienced to be trusted. The older girl, Mara, had argued once too often about what was fair and what was right, and her family had grown tired of her moral questions. Lena, the younger, had merely followed her friend, trusting Mara's judgments while carrying her own secrets of shame and guilt. They had left behind a house that smelled faintly of wood smoke and old books, and the echo of voices that no longer belonged to them. The path ahead was uncertain. Thin clouds traced their way across a muted sky, and the wind whistled low through leafless trees that bordered the road. Every step they took raised little puffs of frozen dust, which lingered in the still air before fading into nothing. Mara's eyes scanned the horizon with a caution born of necessity, noting every dip in the field, every shadow where someone or something might wait. Lena's gaze lingered more often on the earth itself, tracing each imprint in the frost, as if reading a language only the brave or desperate could understand. They had walked for hours. The cold had settled into their bones, making every movement sluggish, every breath visible in the frigid air. Their stomachs gnawed insistently at them, reminding them that this was more than a trial of endurance. It was survival. Yet, even in that hardship, there was a spark, a curiosity, a readiness for something unexpected. Mara tightened her grip on the satchel, the way one might cling to an anchor in a storm. "We should find shelter soon," she said quietly, her voice low but steady, carrying over the whisper of the wind. Lena nodded, though her eyes betrayed a different kind of urgency, a sense that something lay ahead that they could not yet name. It was then, just as the sun tried to pierce the horizon with a weak gold, that they noticed it, the marks in the snow. Large, uneven, and spaced strangely, the hoof prints led from the far edge of the field toward a line of trees that offered the faintest promise of cover. Mara knelt, fingertips brushing over the frost-hardened ground. The impressions were deep, the snow pressed down hard into compact shapes that hinted at weight and fragility all at once. "Horses," she whispered. Not a question, but a recognition. Lena bent closer, shivering, the smell of frost and earth filling her nostrils. She hesitated, then followed Mara's gaze toward the distant tree-line. The thought that someone might have abandoned these creatures stirred something uneasy in her chest, a mixture of fear and moral responsibility she had carried all her life. They moved forward cautiously, each step slow, deliberate, the cold pressing against their bodies like a second skin. The wind shifted, carrying a soft sound that made them pause, a high, thin whinny, distant and trembling. Mara's heart tightened. She looked at Lena, who was already stepping closer to her side, eyes wide, fingers curled into her coat. "Do you hear that?" Mara asked. The sound seemed almost too fragile to believe, yet it was there again, plaintive and persistent, reaching across the frozen field. Mara's mind raced. Who would leave horses out here, pregnant or not, in weather like this? Each whinny echoed the girl's own sense of vulnerability. They had been abandoned themselves. Could they bear to turn away from another creature in need? Lena swallowed hard, shivering. "We have to see," she said, almost in a whisper, though it carried a certainty born not of recklessness but of empathy. Mara nodded, and together they followed the hoof prints toward the tree line, the sound guiding them like a fragile thread in the vast emptiness. The grove of trees came slowly into view, skeletal and silent against the pale sky. As they approached, the wind dropped momentarily, and they caught sight of them. 3 horses huddled together, their coats matted with frost, bodies trembling beneath the weight of new life pressing inside them. One mare lifted her head, nostrils flaring, ears flicking nervously. The sight drew a sharp breath from Mara. Lena's lips parted in awe, fear mingling with the first flicker of hope they had felt all morning. Their small bundle of human frailty mirrored the horse's own precarious existence, and for a heartbeat, the world contracted to the shared vulnerability of the living. Mara crouched low, her hands pressed to her knees as she studied the mares, noting the subtle signs of fatigue and hunger, the way the smallest mare shifted to shelter the others. Lena knelt beside her, fingers tracing the uneven edges of the frozen earth, reading the story of survival and neglect written in the tracks and breath. The sound of whinnying continued, softer now, like a question being asked, a plea for recognition. Mara felt a tight knot in her chest, the same knot that had stayed with her since the moment she was cast out of home. She glanced at Lena, whose eyes shone with unshed tears, and knew without speaking that they would not leave these animals to the cold. Above them, the sun rose a little higher, brushing the frost with muted gold, casting long shadows across the snow-crusted ground. The wind whispered through the trees again, carrying with it the weight of choice, of action yet to be taken. Mara reached for the satchel, checking the meager contents, scraps of cloth, some stale bread, and a thin wool blanket. It was nothing in the face of the cold, but it was all they had. Lena began unwrapping the small bundle of food they carried, the smell of damp grains and dried fruit filling the narrow grove, mingling with the earthy scent of the horses. For a long moment, they simply watched, breathing shallowly, hearts synchronized with the tremble of the animals. The choice was clear now, to act or to retreat into the safety of inaction, to step forward or to step back into the bitter uncertainty that had been their constant companion. Mara's hands tightened around the strap of her satchel. Lena's fingers hovered over the bundle of food, her jaw set in quiet resolve. Outside, the cold remained unyielding, the world indifferent, but here, in this fragile intersection of need and compassion, the girls understood the first lesson of survival. Kindness is a choice, and sometimes it is all that separates life from loss. A single, soft whinny rose from the horses, plaintive yet trusting, and Mara felt the last of her hesitation dissolve. She exhaled, a plume of warm breath mixing with the frosty air, and stepped forward. Lena followed without hesitation, and in that quiet grove, surrounded by frost, pale light, and the tremble of 3 expectant mares, the first act of courage had been made. The world might have abandoned them once, but for these moments, they were together, and together, they would face whatever came next. The grove was small, a cluster of skeletal trees clinging to life in the pale light of a morning that had barely risen. Frost glittered on every branch, and the snow beneath their feet was packed hard by wind, the uneven surface making each step deliberate. Mara and Lena moved cautiously, boots pressing into the frozen crust, breath shallow, hearts pulsing with anticipation and unease. The horses were there, their forms blurred in the dim light, trembling as the wind whispered through the trees. The mares' coats were dull, matted with ice and dried mud, and their eyes held a fragile intelligence, wary but curious, scanning the 2 girls as if assessing whether they were friend or threat. Mara knelt, one hand resting on the snow, feeling its hardness through her fingers. "They're scared," she said softly, voice low enough that it would not carry to the horses. Lena crouched beside her, eyes wide, shivering despite her layered clothes. "I know," she whispered, "but they're pregnant. We can't leave them out here." Her voice cracked with the weight of the realization, The recognition that life was growing inside these creatures in the midst of a cold that could easily take it all. Mara nodded, swallowing against a sudden lump in her throat. The world had cast them out once. Perhaps now it had offered them a chance to do something that mattered. The first mare, smaller than the others, shifted her weight and lowered her head. Mara extended a hand slowly, palm up, letting her presence be calm and unthreatening. The mare's nostrils flared, breath fogging in the cold air, ears twitching. A long moment passed. The frozen grove filled only with a whisper of wind and the faint crunch of distant ice breaking somewhere in the field. Then, with a tentative step, the mare moved closer, sniffing Mara's hand. A subtle exhale of trust, almost imperceptible, passed between them, and Mara's chest lifted slightly, as though she, too, had been unburdened for a moment. Lena's hand hovered over the second mare's flank, her fingers trembling, not from cold, but from the intensity of watching something so fragile accept her care. The mares shifted together, as if instinctively protective of one another, forming a tight, shivering cluster. The sound of their breaths, rhythmic and uneven, filled the grove. Mara could feel her own heartbeat echoing it. She gestured to Lena, pointing toward the thin blanket she had brought. Together, they approached carefully, the horses' muscles taut beneath their frosted coats. Mara draped the blanket over the smallest mare's back, smoothing it with careful fingers. Lena offered a handful of scraps of bread, broken from a small bundle they carried. The mare sniffed, hesitated, and then nibbled slowly, eyes never leaving the girls. It was a small victory, but one that carried the full weight of necessity and care. As they worked, the grove seemed to close around them, the world beyond reduced to wind and distance. Mara's mind raced with practical concerns. How would they keep these horses alive through the day, let alone the coming nights? The mares were hungry, cold, and weary. Their pregnancies added urgency. Each foal inside was a promise, a life that might not survive if the girls failed. Lena noticed the way the smallest mare pressed her side to the others, sharing warmth and instinctive trust, and her own resolve solidified. They could not fail. The distant field offered little cover, but at the edge of the grove, a shallow depression provided the beginnings of a natural shelter. The girls coaxed the mares toward it, speaking in low, even tones. The mares followed reluctantly at first, then with increasing confidence, their trust in Mara and Lena growing with each cautious step. Snow crunched underfoot, ice cracking faintly, but no sudden movement startled the horses. The shelter was modest, a slight overhang of trees and frozen earth, but it offered protection from the wind that threatened to bite deeper with every passing hour. Mara knelt, pressing her hands to the earth beneath the shelter, feeling its cold resilience. She whispered to the mares, though they could not understand words, only tone, reassurance, presence, patience. Lena gathered stray branches and matted leaves, creating a rough bed for warmth beneath the horses. It was not much, but in the frozen grove it was enough to promise life over death, comfort over exposure. Mara glanced at Lena, noticing the way her friend's hands moved with care, lips pressed together, eyes shining with determination. It was a silent pact. Together, they would see this through. A sudden gust rattled the branches above, flinging icy snow into the girls' hair and onto the horses' backs. The mares trembled, eyes wide, ears flicking. Mara wrapped her scarf tighter around her face, speaking softly, coaxing the animals with calm, measured breaths. Lena mirrored her tone, hands steady despite the cold and fear. They worked in tandem, a quiet choreography born of instinct and empathy, each movement deliberate, each glance a silent instruction. Time contracted around them. The outside world, the field, the wind, the distant town, mattered little compared to the immediate reality of survival, care, and connection. Hours passed in this rhythm. The sun rose higher, pale gold against a washed-out sky, but the cold did not relent. Hunger gnawed at the girls, fingers and toes tingling with frost, yet neither faltered. Every small act of tending the horses became a test of patience and resolve. Coaxing a reluctant foal to shift, adjusting the blanket, gathering leaves and branches to patch the shelter. Their exhaustion was profound, yet it was softened by moments of quiet triumph. A mare drinking from a small puddle, a hesitant nuzzle, the collective warmth of bodies pressed together against the wind. By mid-afternoon, the initial tension began to ease. Mara and Lena sank to the snow beside the mares for a brief rest, shoulders pressed against one another. Their breaths came in clouds, mingling with the mist of the horses' own exhales. The grove was silent save for the occasional whisper of wind, a crow in the distance, and the steady rhythm of life persisting despite circumstance. In that stillness, the girls understood the fragile beauty of what they had found. These horses were not merely animals abandoned. They were mirrors of themselves, creatures vulnerable yet resilient, requiring care, patience, and moral courage. As shadows lengthened across the frozen ground, Mara spoke softly, almost to herself. "We can do this," she said. "We have to." Lena nodded, leaning against her friend, eyes closed briefly in a shared moment of exhaustion and resolve. The choice had been made, the commitment quiet but absolute. They would not leave these mares to the cold. And in that choice, they discovered the spark of purpose that had eluded them in the uncertainty of their own exile. The grove seemed to respond, a subtle shift in wind, a pause in the whispering leaves, the mares settling slightly closer together as though acknowledging the girl's presence. Mara lifted her hand, letting it hover over the nearest mare's back, feeling warmth radiate through the coarse hair. Lena pressed a hand to the smallest mare's side, fingers brushing the taut skin over a foal inside. In that silent communion, each understood. Compassion is action, courage is quiet, and even the smallest creatures may demand the greatest effort and the greatest reward. A distant whinny echoed faintly through the trees, thin and tremulous, a reminder of the world beyond the grove. But here, in the fragile intersection of frost, breath, and life, Mara and Lena had found their place. A moment passed, measured not in minutes, but in the rhythm of survival and trust, and for the first time since being cast out, they felt the faint but undeniable stirrings of hope. The wind sharpened in the late afternoon, slicing through the trees with a bitter insistence, carrying with it the first whispers of a coming storm. Mara and Lena had coaxed the mares into the shallow grove, but as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the fragility of their shelter became painfully clear. Branches swayed under the weight of frost, snapping occasionally, sending shivers through the horses. The blankets and leaves they had gathered offered little against the icy gusts that rushed in from the open field. Mara's teeth chattered despite the layers of clothing, but she focused on the task at hand, eyes scanning the small, trembling herd for any signs of distress. Lena knelt beside her, rubbing a mare's flank in small, steady circles, murmuring low reassurances that seemed to reach even through the animal's fear. The first signs of trouble arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. Among the scattered leaves at the grove's edge, Mara noticed a scrap of paper, half buried in frost and dirt. She bent and brushed it free, her breath fogging in the cold air. It was a letter, edges yellowed, ink faded and smeared, though the words could still be read. Instructions, or perhaps excuses, for leaving the mares in this condition. Mara's heart sank as she read. Neglect disguised as necessity, a bureaucratic shrug written in careful penmanship. Lena peered over her shoulder, eyes wide. "They just left them?" she whispered, voice trembling. Mara nodded, the letter trembling in her gloved hands, as though its weight was too much to bear. The grove seemed to tighten around them as the cold deepened, shadows stretching long and sharp. Mara thought of her own abandonment, the quiet expulsion from a home that could not tolerate her questions. She felt a bitter kinship with the mares, creatures left vulnerable to forces beyond their understanding, forced to survive through sheer endurance and instinct. Lena's hand found hers, fingers cold and stiff, and the gesture conveyed more than words ever could. They would not let this cruelty stand unchallenged. Even as the sun faded, another presence made itself known, a distant figure on the edge of the field, moving with deliberate caution. Mara squinted, shading her eyes against the pale twilight. The man was middle-aged, dressed in heavy winter gear that bore the faint scent of leather and smoke. He observed from afar, a clipboard tucked under one arm, eyes scanning the grove with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. Mara's chest tightened. Lena instinctively pressed closer, but Mara shook her head slightly. "Wait," she whispered. "Let's see." They watched silently, the Maras huddled together, trembling, unaware of the human eyes upon them. The man's attention was not gentle. He circled the grove, pausing now and then to make marks on the clipboard, muttering words that carried over the wind. Mara's stomach turned. He was not here to help. He was here to judge, to quantify, to enforce a system that saw life in terms of balance sheets and liability rather than care. Lena shivered, a quiet wave of fear passing through her. Mara put a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "We can't let him," she began, but paused, realizing that any rash movement might startle the horses. They stayed crouched behind a fallen branch, observing, listening, hearts hammering in tandem with the wind. Hours passed in tense silence. The man eventually left, his departure signaled only by the faint crunch of boots fading over frost-hardened ground. Mara exhaled, a plume of warm air dissipating into the cold, and Lena sank to the snow, brushing her hair from her eyes. "Why would anyone?" she started, then faltered. Mara shook her head. "Because some people see life as expendable. Some lessons are cruel, and not everyone chooses kindness." Her voice was quiet, but the weight of truth pressed against them like the encroaching frost. They turned their attention back to the Mares, whose trembling had increased as night began to fall. The girls' minds were not idle. They began assessing what they had and what they needed. The Mares required nourishment, warmth, and safety. Their own supplies were meager, their strength limited. Yet Mara refused to let despair take root. They scouted the grove carefully, gathering twigs, dead leaves, and clumps of moss, layering them beneath the Mares to provide minimal insulation. Lena carried snow from a nearby drift, carefully melting it over a small campfire Mara had coaxed to life, producing lukewarm water for the Mares to drink. Each act was slow, deliberate, almost meditative, a counterbalance to the harshness of the world around them. The rhythm of survival became a quiet mantra: tend, protect, endure. As night settled, the moral weight of the situation pressed heavier. Mara pulled the letter from her pocket again, studying the words, the instructions, the faint apology hidden beneath bureaucratic language. It was a small betrayal, a confirmation that the cruelty they faced was not random, but systemic. Lena's hands rested on the smallest mare's side, feeling the faint stir of life beneath her fingers, and she whispered, "We'll do better." "We have to." Mara nodded. They were young, powerless in the eyes of the world, but in this grove, they held the balance of life and death. That responsibility, terrifying and raw, ignited a fierce determination neither had known they possessed. The wind rose sharply, rattling branches and sending a light spray of snow over the makeshift shelter. Mara adjusted the blanket again, securing it with knots that might hold through the night. Lena leaned close to the horses, murmuring soft encouragements. Her own fear mingled with wonder at the resilience of these creatures. Each heartbeat in the grove felt amplified, the tension of exposure and neglect pressing on them with relentless weight. Outside, the world remained indifferent, but inside, small acts of care shaped the contours of hope. As darkness deepened, a faint glow appeared on the horizon, lamplight from the town, muted by distance and frost. Mara and Lena could see silhouettes moving in the streets, life continuing beyond the grove. And yet, they felt a quiet separation from that world. Their reality was here, among the trembling Mares, the bitter wind, the cold earth. They were the guardians of something precious, a responsibility thrust upon them by circumstance and morality alike. In that shared understanding, they discovered a kind of courage that had nothing to do with age or experience and everything to do with choice. The night fell fully, wrapping the grove in muted blue and silver. The horses nestled closely together for warmth. Mara and Lena huddled beside them, exhausted, fingers stiff, eyelids heavy, yet unable to close their minds entirely. Questions pressed at the edges of their thoughts. Who had abandoned these creatures? Why were some humans capable of cruelty while others clung to mercy? And most pressing of all, would their small acts of care be enough to withstand the coming storm? The answers were uncertain, and the grove, though quiet, seemed to pulse with the fragile possibility of life. Mara reached for Lena's hand, holding it firmly against the cold. "We've done what we can," she said. "Now we wait and we watch." Lena nodded, eyes reflecting the dim glow of snow and starlight, feeling the faint stirrings of pride and purpose. The Mares, for their part, had begun to relax slightly, small movements of trust rippling through the group. In the midst of cruelty and neglect, a measure of hope had taken root. The night was long, and the storm promised to be unforgiving, but the girls had chosen to stand with what was weak and vulnerable. And sometimes, the choice itself was enough to turn despair into possibility. The wind had shifted overnight, bringing with it a low, icy pressure that pressed against the small grove like a living thing. Mara woke first, shivering in the dim light of dawn, breath swirling in tight, white clouds. The Mares were restless, shifting uneasily, bodies taut with tension as if they sensed what Mara and Lena could not yet see. Mara's hands were raw from yesterday's efforts, collecting branches, coaxing the Mares to drink, patching the shelter, but exhaustion had not dulled her resolve. She rose slowly, glancing over the herd. One of the larger Mares lowered her head toward Mara, a subtle gesture of trust. Mara exhaled, letting herself feel the weight of responsibility settle fully across her shoulders. Lena stirred beside her, blanket wrapped tightly, eyes adjusting to the cold gray of early morning. "They're moving more than usual," she murmured, voice low, almost reverent. Mara nodded. "The storm is coming, but we've kept them alive so far. That counts for something." Lena's eyes shifted to the edge of the grove, where faint tracks in the snow marked the approach of human presence. Mara's heart tightened. She had expected it. They were not alone in this world, and not everyone would approve of their small acts of defiance against neglect. The first confrontation arrived in the form of a truck, its tires crunching over the frozen field like distant thunder. Mara recognized the figure instantly. The rancher from the previous day, bundled in a heavy coat, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and narrow. He stopped at the edge of the grove, assessing the scene with a critical gaze that weighed both horses and girls, as if calculating profit and loss. Mara stepped forward slowly, Lena at her side, fingers brushing together in silent solidarity. "We've been caring for them," Mara said, her voice steady though her chest tightened. "They were abandoned. They needed help." The rancher snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound that carried over the grove. "Abandoned? That's your interpretation. They belong to the land, and the land belongs to me. You have no authority here." His gaze swept the Mares, lingering on their swollen sides, the faint ripple of life beneath their coats. Mara felt anger rise, not sharp or loud, but steady and molten. Lena's fingers tightened on the blanket she had patched over the smallest mare's back. There were two girls, yes, small and vulnerable by most standards, but in this grove they had power of a different sort: care, patience, and moral clarity. Mara's voice did not waver. "Authority without conscience is nothing. They are alive because we chose to act. If you take them now, they will suffer." The rancher's eyes flicked to the foal moving faintly beneath the smallest mare, and a shadow of hesitation crossed his face. Mara sensed it, a crack in the armor of indifference. She stepped closer, hands open, palms visible. "We can show you what we've done, how they are fed, warmed, and protected. You can see for yourself. A tense silence stretched, the cold pressing against every exposed inch of skin. The Maras shifted uneasily, sensing the unease in the human figures. Mara noticed the subtle rise and fall of their sides, the small movements of foals pressing beneath, and she felt the urgency of the moment sharpen. Lena stepped forward, producing the satchel of documents she had collected, photographs of the abandoned tack, letters left behind, small notes showing the neglect. "This is proof," she said, voice firmer than she expected. "They were left to die. We saved them." The rancher frowned, scanning the papers, muttering under his breath. The frost in the air seemed heavier now, pressing down as if the grove itself were waiting for a verdict. Mara and Lena exchanged a brief glance, each seeing in the other the same mix of exhaustion and determination. They had survived exposure, hunger, and uncertainty, but this was different. This was a challenge to their conviction, a confrontation between moral truth and systemic power. And they would not flinch. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of cold wind and careful negotiation. Mara spoke softly, recounting every act of care, every measure taken to protect the Maras. Lena supplemented, describing how they had coaxed water from the ice, gathered insulation, and fed the pregnant animals when they themselves had gone without. The rancher listened, eyes narrowing, clipboard forgotten as the weight of evidence accumulated. The Maras shifted closer to the girls, their bodies forming a small, protective circle that mirrored the human bond beside them. At last, the rancher exhaled sharply, the sound breaking the tension like ice cracking underfoot. "Fine," he muttered, tone grudging but contained. "Leave them here for now. But you're responsible. Any harm, and you answered me." Mara's chest lifted slightly. Lena exhaled, fingers relaxing. The confrontation was not one with anger or defiance, but with quiet demonstration of competence and conscience. The girls had held firm against indifference, proving that morality carries weight even when authority does not. The storm arrived hours later, snow thick and heavy, wind lashing the grove. Mara and Lena huddled close to the Maras, warmth shared through bodies pressed together, breaths mingling in the icy air. The Maras moved with increasing ease, their confidence in the girls' care evident in small nudges and gentle shifts. The foals stirred beneath their mothers' sides, weak but alive, tiny movements that carried the full promise of future life. Mara brushed the frost from a mare's muzzle, whispering reassurances, while Lena adjusted the blanket to cover the smallest mare. Every action was deliberate, infused with a hard-earned knowledge of responsibility and compassion. By evening, the storm had passed, leaving a pale, still landscape, silvered by ice and frost. Mara and Lena stood at the edge of the grove, watching as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the frozen field. The Maras grazed carefully, heads bent, bodies relaxed in ways they had not allowed before. The girls' exhaustion was profound, but it was softened by the quiet triumph of survival, of moral integrity held and proven. Mara looked at Lena, eyes shining in the fading light. "We did it," she said softly. Lena nodded, her own voice catching. "We saved them." The grove seemed transformed, a place of life and resilience rather than abandonment. Mara and Lena had begun the morning as two girls cast out by the world, their futures uncertain, their own survival precarious. Now, they stood as protectors, witnesses, and moral arbiters in a small but significant battle. The Maras trusted them. The foals inside moved, proof of a life preserved through quiet courage. Outside, the world remained indifferent, but inside the grove, a measure of justice had been carved with patient hands and unwavering conscience. Night fell fully, casting the grove in pale blues and silvers. The Maras nestled together, their breaths rising in clouds that mingled with the girls' own. Mara sat beside them, letting the warmth of life and survival seep into her bones. Lena leaned against her, head resting lightly on Mara's shoulder, eyes half closed in relief and exhaustion. They had faced cruelty indifference, and their own doubts, and emerged not unscathed, but triumphant in the only way that mattered, through steadfast care, moral clarity, and perseverance. In the hush of night, Mara whispered, almost to herself, "Some lessons come only to those who refuse to give up." The mares stirred gently, foals pressing beneath their mothers, and the girls felt the quiet echo of their own journey reflected in these fragile lives. The grove was still, the storm behind them, and the future ahead, uncertain but brightened by the knowledge that they had chosen courage and compassion when it mattered most. And for Mara and Lena, that was enough. As they settled for the night, the wind softened, carrying away the last echoes of fear and doubt. The grove was alive with quiet movement. The gentle shifting of the mares, the faint stirrings of unborn life, the steady presence of two young girls who had been cast out and yet had found their purpose. In that stillness, they understood the profound truth. Moral courage may be quiet, but it shapes the world in ways that even the harshest storms cannot undo. And in the pale glow of dawn to come, they would rise again, guardians of life and hope, knowing that sometimes the smallest hands hold the greatest power.